J N Dixit, born in Madras in 1936, was educated in various parts of India as his parents were peripatetic freedom fighters. He finally ended up in Delhi, completing his post-graduation in international law and international relations. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1958. Until 1991, he served in different capacities in Indian embassies in South America, North America, Western Europe and Japan, apart from stints at headquarters in the Ministry of External Affairs. Dixit's tour of duty took him to Bhutan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. He was also involved in assignments related to the UN, the Non-Aligned Movement and SAARC. After retirement, Dixit has been engaged in writing for newspapers and journals, apart from teaching in various universities both in India and abroad. His latest book is Across Borders, published by Picus Books. In this book, J N Dixit, India's former Foreign Secretary, paints a broad canvas stretching across a time span of more than 50 years with bold, powerful and authoritative strokes. We have invited J N Dixit and Professor Kanti Bajpai to discuss the book Across Borders.
Mr. Dixit, Across Borders is of course a survey book, an argumentative, analytical, fact-ridden survey, but it is a survey, and from a survey I think most readers would ask a very natural question first of all, which is, do you see an overall pattern to Indian foreign policy over 50 years, diverse circumstances, diverse leaders and diverse challenges?
Yes, the pattern is in two dimensions. First, a very serious concern about survival, independence and maintaining one's new identity as a free, united country. The second is a sense of self in the international aspect, that India must play a role, India has to play a role, India is predestined to play a role. These are the two, what you call, leitmotifs which have been deep undercurrents in India's foreign policy.
Yeah. It's said always that of course the primordial or even primeval pattern is non-alignment itself, and interestingly you don't, in your remarks here at least, mention non-alignment, and of course there's a lot of question of non-alignment today. Do you not see non-alignment then as the touchstone, or is that too generalized a description?
No, I make a distinction, which I have in this book of mine, between being non-aligned and being part of an amorphous group called the non-aligned movement. I think being non-aligned is not only the touchstone, but also should be the imperative terms of reference of our foreign policy, because it simply means that you retain unto yourself the freedom of options to decide what is good for you in terms of foreign relations, defense, development, without being subject to external influences to the extent feasible.
Yeah.
I advisedly use the word extent feasible because international pressure is always there in one form or the other. But being part of the movement is that you have presumably got together with a group which is like-minded, along with which you would be able to generate forces in international politics which will strengthen the process of autonomy in decision making about yourself, which has not been the case. And in that sense I attach a greater importance to non-alignment as a basic principle than the non-aligned movement as such.
Yeah, a foreign policy strategy rather than a grouping.
Yes,
in that
yes,
sense.
yes. And if I may mention here, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru was not in favor of the movement in the initial stages.
Quite, he didn't want to build a third force, which would itself become
a bloc.
A bloc, yes. I think most people would ask, Mr. Dixit, what is the balance sheet of Indian foreign policy? Has this thing called Indian foreign policy, with all its accumulated practices and so on, been a success, or shall we judge it on balance not so successful? Have we done well in terms of protecting our national security, cultivating important friendships, and indeed solving important quarrels?
I would judge our foreign policy on two criteria. First, how far has it served in preserving our interests in terms of the points which you have made. Friendship, preserving national security, territorial integrity, ensuring economic well-being. The second criteria is comparing our successes or failures with other countries who are similarly placed and who have evolved in a similar context. And on both these counts, I think we have done fairly well. I mean, except in the case of our losing part of Kashmir and some parts of our territorial boundaries with China, we have preserved the territorial limits of our republic with a fair amount of success despite internal centrifugal forces and external challenges. We might not have done as well as we could in developmental matters, but we have ensured basic economic food security and basic requirements of life for a burgeoning population, which is a very difficult task. And this has been achieved when we have consciously adopted the more difficult path of democracy for national consolidation and for our governance. And in a plural, diverse society like ours, it was a very difficult choice which we made. And compared to all other developing countries, I think we have succeeded. So on both these criteria, I would say that I'm not saying we have been successful in every respect or that there have not been shortcomings or failures. But in overall terms, the balance sheet is black. It is credit.
Would it be fair to say that in fact the picture you paint is a kind of a Nehruvian picture, and that the approach the book seems to extol in some ways is a Nehruvian one? I ask this particularly because, you know, increasingly there's something of an impatience with our first Prime Minister. It's not uncommon to hear him described now as somewhat woolly-headed, somewhat too idealistic, perhaps not quite attuned to power politics and so on.
I don't agree with that analysis, because you must look at Panditji's evolution as the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of this country. Nehru of 1946 was not the Nehru of 1955 or 1962. I am choosing these dates rather deliberately. The Nehru of 46 was the Nehru who had participated in the Congress of Oppressed Peoples in Brussels in 1927. He was full of idealism. He had a vision of the world where reason and peaceful means and principles of harmony shall govern international relations, and if you are on the moral high ground, no harm could come to you. This was his thesis. But once he saw how the Kashmir issue was treated at the UN, though he himself had gone to the UN, though he was on the victorious path in Kashmir militarily, and the way it was dealt with, he learnt his first lesson. And I think he started moving towards a transmutation of realpolitik considerations into foreign policy sometime from 1949-50 onwards. Apart from Kashmir, the way the Western democracies responded to his requests for inputs into India, technological and others, they were reticent. The precondition was that you must join the Cold War. If you are not with us, you are against us, you are evil. That kind of thesis, the Deleuzian approach, was a great education for him. And I will not question the criticism that in the initial phase of our independence he was idealistic and he was not ready to accept the harsher aspects of realpolitik and strategic operations. But as he grew in office and as he saw India facing problems and the manner in which the international community, the major powers, reacted to India, he became more and more realistic. And of course, the military defeat of 1962, though he was in frail health, transformed his approach to international relations. And if you look at the initial processes of India's becoming defense conscious in terms of infrastructural facilities for defense and external cooperation for defense purposes, it was Nehru who initiated it at the end of 1962. And there also, he did not just depend on one country. He went to the United States, he went to the Soviet Union, he went to England. He made India's defense cooperation initiatives multifaceted and
Well, he laid the basis for the Indian nuclear program, itself,
yes.
indigenous defense
Absolutely,
production,
absolutely.
and carried out a defense review.
So I do not agree with this criticism, and in fact I would go to the other extreme in my argument, that if Nehru were alive today, he would perhaps have done precisely what we are doing.
So in that sense, Nehruvianism broadly, whether especially of the later type, in some sense is still relevant.
Yes.
Are you still a Nehruvian in that sense?
Yes, I think so.
An evolving Nehru.
I'm convinced about two things. He had a profound sense of what national interest is. He was not amoral, but he had become realistic with the passage of time. And he was ready to accept his wrong assessments of previous times.
Yeah. Could I ask you one very specific thing that comes up in the book, which I was rather impressed by, and this is a frequent point raised against Nehru, and it relates to Kashmir, of course, and that is in 48. He took the issue to the Security Council and stopped Indian forces. And people 50 years have been asking why he did it. And I know you deal with it in the book, and I thought it might be interesting for viewers to hear what your reply, in a sense, to that question.
There were two motivations which made him go to the United Nations, apart from Mountbatten's advice, which he relied on in 1948, which he did not later on. First was, he wanted to prove to the international community that his approach that coercive force should not be used for resolving political disputes. That point he wanted to prove by India acting accordingly. And particularly when India was in a dominant position, when India was capable of achieving its aim by military means, his going to the UN was a deliberate act of proving that he practiced what he preached. The second motivation was his innate persona as a democrat. He felt that, of course, the state had acceded to India, the Maharaja had acceded, the National Conference had endorsed the decision, but he felt that if through impartial international intervention Pakistani troops and intruders could be withdrawn and an atmosphere could be created where the average citizen of Jammu and Kashmir could express his wish, he would have liked to abide by it. These were the two motivations. And he realized quite fast that that was not the case in terms of reactions and in terms of ultimate results. Instead of being a complainant, we became a disputant. And the merits of the case were totally forgotten by the UN as well as the great powers.
Yeah. I'll come back to Kashmir a little later because you've said some other interesting things in the book. Let me ask another question. You have quite boldly, in a way, rated the various prime ministers in terms of their foreign policy knowledge and aptitude. And if I might just very crudely summarize it, I think you put the Nehrus, all three of them, and Shastriji, Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee ji really on the high side, and Mr. Gujral and VP Singh less high. But my question is somewhat different. I think readers can assess for themselves whether they agree with you or not. I've got a more general question. What makes a good diplomat and a good foreign minister, indeed a good prime minister who can deal with foreign policy consistently?
Well, there's a difference between what makes a good prime minister and foreign minister and what makes a good diplomat. Let me begin at the lower end of the scale. A functioning diplomat, I'm more experienced in that. I think the qualities which make a good diplomat are a capacity to perceive what national interests are, an equally competent ability to assess what the impact of the policies of other countries would be on those interests. Third, to be able to give uninhibited, untrammeled, objective advice on what the prospects are, what are the options to deal with them, what are the implications of those options, and to make recommendations. This is what makes a good diplomat. And here it is not a question of being obfuscatory or polite. In all this, he has to be totally honest, precise in his articulation, and should have a clear courage of convictions in giving advice. As far as a prime minister or a foreign minister is concerned, of course, the first quality is common to both, a capacity to perceive national interests. Perhaps the prime minister and foreign minister have a greater responsibility for this, because they are supposed to be representing the people and therefore supposed to have a greater knowledge about the impulses of public opinion related to foreign policy and national interests. Second, they should have a capacity to examine the options and advice given on merits and give precise decisions, give precise, clear decisions on what policy orientations should be.
To be leaders, in fact.
Yes. Thirdly, they should have a capacity to transcend. This is utopian, but I personally feel that they should have a capacity to transcend considerations of political survival and do what is really good for the country. And lastly, they should be capable of bold decisions, even if they are unpopular at times, if it serves the country's long-term interests. And they should be decisive, and they should not be ambiguous and delayed in their decisions and reactions.
This is essentially a matter of statesmanship, in other words.
Yes.
How do you see the prospects of statesmanship?
And one more point.
Yeah.
They should be able to have a positive functional chemistry with the bureaucracy, the civil service. They should not conceive of it as a exercise in scoring debating points or proving their greater wisdom compared to the diplomat, regardless of whether one or the other is more wise. The question is a clinical assessment of what is good.
Yeah. In terms of your criteria, are you optimistic that we will get this kind of leadership in India?
Well, there are some leaders who have shown this capacity, others who don't have it. And it's very difficult to make a precise quantitative judgment. But I think as we gain more experience, let us remember that this is the first time in our entire recorded history that Indian nationhood has been territorially defined. The Republic today has never existed as a territorially defined unified political entity. One. Second is the first time that we are going through experiences of modern diplomatic relations. I am beginning from the 19th century till today. Or let us date it back to the Treaty of Westphalia when nation states emerged. The first time we are going through this experience. So as we gain in experience and as our political cadres get involved in these processes, I am sure leadership with competence and vision would be thrown up.
Let me ask you another question on the diplomatic issue, and it's not really there in your book, it seems to me, if I might say so. And there's a kind of picture of Indian diplomacy. I don't mean Indian diplomats, but Indian diplomacy as being rather legalistic in its kind of approach, very proceduralistic. And that Indian diplomats and diplomacy always want to define some sort of elemental first principle. And then, you know, from there you could sort of define or deduce what you want to do in a particular situation. And both Westerners, it's been said, find this hard to deal with. They're more pragmatic, deal-making. If you go to Southeast Asia, there's this kind of musyawara, relentless talking and ease-making kind of diplomacy. Is that a fair assessment or criticism of Indian diplomacy?
The criticism is partially correct, but it is not a passion for procedure and legal first principles. It is more a deep-seated psyche of didacticism. We tend to be fond of giving lectures to everybody.
Some
From
long-term
a higher
cultural-
intellectual and moral terms of reference, which partially we inherited from Panditji without his wisdom. The diplomatic psyche of our foreign service and our foreign policy establishment inherited the style without the substance of Panditji. And but that is changing now. I think over the last decade, the hard knocks that we have got here and there is making our foreign policy establishment more realistic, more matter of fact, and more inclined towards problem solving rather than a problem defining approach.
Now, you said on that note some interesting things with respect to China, and you know, you take quite a pragmatic problem solving approach. You're not uncritical of India's record on this. What do you see now as the sort of way ahead with China, and what do you think were some of the major errors that we committed? I know you've got some.
Well, historically, I think we took a historically obstinate stand, I would say. There is no inaccuracy in the Chinese point that, well, these boundaries are inherited from colonial rule, which is factually correct. Instead of saying, no, it is not so, these are perennial boundaries which we have had we said, okay, we accept this, but let us now adhere to principles of international law on how boundaries are determined in mountainous areas where there are watersheds. Perhaps we could have come to some compromise. The second point which I mentioned in the book is that the great McMahon line, the memorandum of the McMahon line does not match the map accompanying it, because a very thick pen was used, where if you use the cartographic scales, it can affect thousands of kilometers, just the thickness of the line. Thirdly, I think we refused compromises suggested by Chu and Lai. Anyway, that is all in the past. Fourth, of course, it is we who launched the military operations, saying throw them out on the advice of certain segments of our military command. But the contemporary phase, I think I had hoped that after the progress made up to 94 between Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China and Narasimha Rao's visit, Rajiv Gandhi's visit in 1988 and Narasimha Rao's visit in September 93, momentum was generated which could have taken us on to the resolving the boundary question. But somehow after Narasimha Rao lost his own dynamism in foreign policy between 94 and 96 because of his domestic concerns, and the succeeding governments just did not attend to the processes which were initiated. I'll give you an example. During the last round of my negotiations on the agreement on maintaining peace and tranquility on the line of actual control, which was signed in September 93, the present foreign minister of China, Tang, told me that, okay, these confidence building measures, delineation of the line of control, etc., we will go through the joint working group. Let us at the vice foreign secretary's level and vice minister's level start the process for discussing the boundary, because we must prove to the world that this agreement on the line of control is not the basis for the boundary. Boundary is a separate issue, which was very, very conducive to our interests. And he said, let us at least negotiate and define certain new principles. And these principles will not refer to the past negotiations. We will not indulge in the arguments about inherited from colonialism and you saying no eternal boundaries. We shall use a formula based on international law. We shall use modern, latest cartographic methods to determine the natural features. Then we will, on the basis of these data, structure compromises which meet our mutual strategic and geological interests or water territorial interests. He said this is informal at present, but we can, when we meet in the next round, do that. 96, before Jiang Zemin was coming here, I was invited by the People's Consultative Committee of China for a seminar.
Let me take you to another rather interesting area of the book. You were fairly critical of the handling of what you call two poignant issues. These are the issues of Kashmir and, of course, the Babri Masjid. Could I ask, first of all, what basically went wrong? And perhaps more for the longer term, what are the special problems in a democracy of these kinds of internal yet simultaneously external problems? And how, from a diplomat's point of view, what are the kinds of very difficult...
Kashmir is a very difficult question to answer. I feel that I have no quarrel with Panditji's idealism, but it was misplaced. We need not have gone to the UN. We should have completed the thing. The second time we missed the boat, in my opinion, was 1972, Simla in July. We could have told Bhutto that, look, prisoners of war will go back, we'll give back all your territory. Let us get this problem out of the way. And we should have insisted on his commitment being included in the agreement, a commitment which he gave, that the line of control should be readjusted by military commanders, and that will become the international frontier. And after that, I don't think there has been any chance to resolve the problem. As far as Babri Mosque is concerned, I am clear in my mind that the political leadership plus the certain members of the Home Civil Service did not act decisively in time, which could have been done. I have said in the book, we had sufficient force a few kilometers away from the mosque, and there is no need for any oppression or violence. All that we had to do was deploy about 1/10 of them around the mosque, and the mob would have melted away. This is my view. I mentioned it to the then Cabinet Secretary and said, please, because we have an apex committee of secretaries where we discuss these matters, security. I told him, this is my view. I was supported by the then Home Secretary and the then Defence Secretary, Mr. Vora and Mr. Godbole. But the then Cabinet Secretary, Mr. Rajgopal, somehow did not convey this. And it would not have been right for us to sort of transcend his authority and go and tell the Prime Minister, but ultimately the Prime Minister himself was aware of the deployment of security forces. He could have stopped
There is the very large issue that you pose. The world order is basically hegemonistic, led by a coalition of the United States and its allies, which nevertheless have some contradictions between them. What do you think is the room for maneuver for India in such a complex way?
I think we should, first of all, carefully and constantly monitor the contradictions and see which of these contradictions can be utilized to develop equations which shall further our national interests. That's the broad conceptual response I can give you. I am not conceiving of joining rival blocs or creating dissensions within groups of countries. Dissensions and competitions are natural. International relations shall remain an amoral phenomenon. If we can, and one characteristic is that foreign policies tend to make virtues out of opportunities and interpret opportunities as virtuous. So we should be conscious of this reality and develop equations with all concerned, and to the extent possible avoid any what you call categorical confrontation with any country.
Is this the way forward broadly in this post-Pokhran II period then, to try and broaden our diplomacy, engage in more and more of these dialogues? Of course, we've got one going with the United States, to send out groups to engage other societies as well, their NGOs and so on.
Yes.
Is that the wave of the future?
I think we should interact with civil societies, with academia, with public opinion. We must use the delightful American arrangement, constructive engagement with everybody. And if I may be country specific, we are focusing on the United States, West Europe, France, etc., and the Russian Federation. I think we must give special attention to improving our relations with Japan and China, and we must assuage the concerns, give assurances or generate assurances to the ASEAN region and the SAARC region.
Well, Mr. Dixit, thank you for a very wide tour de horizon, as well as, of course, the great depth as you brought in your book, to the whole issue of Indian foreign policy, to grander themes and very particular ones. The book again, Across Borders, 50 Years of Indian Foreign Policy. Thank you for sharing your thoughts at this critical moment and shedding light on perhaps at least the next decade of the next 50 years.
Well, I don't know 50 years, but thank you. Thank you. But this much I can say. If this book provokes a sufficient and continuous introspection and cogitation about a vital aspect of our national existence, then it would have served its purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.